Hello, my name is Mike Siegel. I'm the Executive Director for PeDRA, and I'm happy to be here to present this webinar on patient engagement with a focus on two things. First being the Engagement Award that PeDRA received in 2019 from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. I'll be providing an overview of what that award is and what PeDRA will be doing with it to strengthen its ties between research and the patient community. And then I'll provide an overview of the 2019 PeDRA Annual Conference, where we had about 30 representatives in attendance from the patient, family, and advocate communities who were there to participate in general activities as well as patient-focused programming. And I hope the outcomes from this webinar, particularly the last portion of the discussion around the annual conference, can be of some benefit to both patients and researchers in the PeDRA community as they consider next steps moving forward to conduct meaningful research in the field of pediatric dermatology. So as I get into the first portion of the webinar, which will be discussing the PeDRA Engagement Award, just to get back to the basics around why PeDRA exists in the first place and why it's very worthwhile to be conducting research in the field of pediatric skin disease. First off, pediatric skin diseases are extremely prevalent, affecting roughly 1 in 4 children in the United States. They're extremely significant in that they take a devastating toll on the physical, social, and psychosocial health of patients and their families. And resources are limited for patients and families, as well as healthcare providers who are fighting against pediatric skin disease. For one thing, there are few pediatric dermatologists in the country. There are few FDA-approved treatment options. And the pace of research to come around with new effective treatment options is quite slow. So to help address these challenges, the Pediatric Dermatology Research Alliance was formed in 2013 and has grown at a healthy pace over time to now include about 300 members supporting about 50 collaborative research studies, hosting a number of educational activities, competitive research grants programs, and much more. And fundamentally, what PeDRA does is it cultivates new research, both early stage research ideas and early to mid-career investigators, as well as individuals at any stage of their career who are conducting research in pediatric dermatology. We support high impact, primarily collaborative research in the field, and we seek to build an educated and empowered community of clinician scientists and other key stakeholders in the field to advance pediatric dermatology and improve the lives of children and their families. Now, the remainder of at least the first portion of this webinar will really focus around building community, around conducting research in pediatric dermatology. And a lot of that gets back to what has really shaped PeDRA and the evolution of it as an organization ever since its inception, which is putting patients at the center of all of its activities, counting patients as their primary stakeholder in the conduct of research projects of any size or scope, always keeping that in mind. And that introduces the concept of patient-centered outcomes research, which is always putting high priority patient questions at the center of research activities, considering what questions patients would be asking and what questions they would most importantly like to have answered for the improvement of their lives and their overall health. Always assessing the benefits and harms of care on patients, always focusing on what patients notice and care about, and being inclusive of a variety of settings and individuals as you conduct your research, keeping in mind that you want the outcomes of research to have the broadest possible impact and improve lives for the most possible patients, the largest number of patients. With these things in mind, in 2019, PeDRA pursued funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute and was very happy to have received a capacity building engagement award entitled Building Capacity for Patient-Centered Outcomes Research in Pediatric Dermatology. The award will run from 2019 to 2021, and the focus of the activities under the award are really in two primary bins. One being education, educating patients to be meaningful participants in the research process, as well as educating researchers around how to most appropriately and beneficially involve patients in the research that they're doing. So that two-way education, educating both stakeholder communities, patients and researchers, to move research forward in the best possible way. Beyond that, we are investing in engagement between patients and research communities. So doing what we can to put in place an ongoing sustainable infrastructure for patient engagement within PeDRA so that engagement doesn't crop up from time to time at a conference or during a very active period for research study, but it's always there. Patients are always at the table of researchers. Researchers are always at the table of patients. And PeDRA research and the outcomes of that research are always being influenced by that interaction between the two communities. So how will we accomplish this? Well, first of all, we made an investment in PeDRA's digital infrastructure by redoing the PeDRA website and building out a patient-focused component of the website, which is anchored around education for both researchers and patients. So the design of the website, and this can be observed now if you visit PedraResearch.org, this portion of the project has been completed. If you're a patient or you're a researcher, you can enter the website through different channels where you find either patient-focused or research-focused content. And from those separate platforms, you can then be directed back to a shared platform for education, where education will be directed to researchers and to patients and to both audiences, so that we can facilitate this ongoing education between both communities in both directions to strengthen our entire stakeholder community around the pursuit of pediatric dermatology research. And ultimately, what we hope to see in terms of outcomes are educated and empowered patients and families, educated researchers who are connected to the patient perspective, and the development of high-priority patient research questions really influencing PeDRA research in a meaningful way. In terms of engagement, we are putting in place a PeDRA Patient Advisory Committee, something that will be a standing committee as part of PeDRA's organization that is available 12 months a year to evaluate new study ideas coming through PeDRA, to provide ongoing feedback to investigators within PeDRA who are doing research, to help disseminate progress and outcomes from PeDRA research studies, and very importantly, to identify cross-cutting themes that can impact PeDRA on a large scale beyond the operation of its individual research studies, activities within its disease-specific working groups, to cut across all pediatric skin diseases, bring together the strength of PeDRA as an entire network, and pursue deeply impactful cross-cutting themes research. Finally, facilitating in-person engagement is a big part of the Engagement Award. And this will take two forms, one being supporting the travel and the engagement of patients, families, and advocates at the PeDRA Annual Conference, which, as depicted on the map here in 2019, took place in Chicago, Illinois, but also investing in PeDRA members for them to travel and participate in the conferences hosted by different patient advocacy organizations. So for one thing, getting patients involved in a research meeting hosted by PeDRA is extremely important. And then just as important really is getting researchers from the PeDRA community involved in patient-focused meetings in their space, hearing from them about what's important to them, seeing what's going on, seeing who else might be at those conferences, and really learning a lot and making a strong connection between PeDRA and its partnering advocacy organizations in this way. So with the rest of the webinar, I'll be talking about the 2019 PeDRA Annual Conference, which took place in Chicago, Illinois. The conference hosted just over 200 attendees, had 58 posters, and about 8.5 hours of focused work group time where PeDRA's different disease area working groups were able to come together to discuss research, form collaborations, and move science forward. Mixed in amongst this agenda for the very first time, we had 5 patient-specific activities mixed in, and we branded that a patient track, or the parallel patient track, which hosted 28 patients, parents, and advocates, where they were able to come together, not only participate in different portions of the conference where every attendee was present, something like a poster session or keynote presentations, plenary sessions, but then during work group time to work amongst themselves and discuss things that were important to patients, learn
from PeDRA researchers and other experts about the research process. And as we'll talk about on this webinar, really come out with outcomes that I think can help shape the future of PeDRA research or help move us in that direction. At the conference, 10 patient groups are represented as depicted by the logos that you can see on the screen. We welcomed childhood patients, adult patients, parents, leadership from advocacy organizations. All these different individuals were present at the conference. We really had a wonderful breakdown of representation from the different groups. And the patients, those who participated in the patient track, participated in what you see on the screen now, a simplified agenda on Thursday, the first day of the conference, easing in pretty easily to the events of the conference, just getting settled, getting to know each other, doing a couple of icebreakers. On Friday then, having the opportunity to connect with PeDRA researchers through their disease-specific work groups, so to actually introduce themselves to the groups, ask questions, share their story, share their questions to the group, the different research groups. Then to spend some time learning about the research process. We had wonderful presentations to the patients from Anna Bruckner, who is a professor at the University of Colorado and chair of the PeDRA Studies Committee, and she discussed the research process. We had a wonderful presentation from Julie Lesh from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute on patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research specifically. And then we had another wonderful presentation from Amy Peller, professor at Northwestern University and one of the founding chairs of PeDRA, on her ongoing large-scale pan-PeDRA stigma study on the psychosocial burden and mental health components of pediatric skin diseases. In addition to that learning, we spent a lot of time within the patient track discussing their experiences and specifically looking for cross-cutting themes. I touched on this earlier in the slide deck. One of the big opportunities within PeDRA is to work beyond its individual projects, beyond the disease-specific work groups, to address large-scale studies similar to the pan-PeDRA stigma study that Dr. Peller is running, where research questions are asked that can impact multiple, if not all, pediatric skin diseases. And by bringing patients into the process in this way, this is really an opportunity to identify some of those large-scale cross-cutting issues that impact patients with multiple diseases. So we spent a lot of time discussing these cross-cutting themes, and that's what I'll spend most of the rest of this webinar actually talking about and sharing some of the outcomes from that discussion, because I think those are the outcomes that we can see most readily translated into PeDRA research, PeDRA activities, and things that you can see down the road. Finally, on Saturday, which was the last day of the conference, we had a very casual debrief, recap kind of session where we very freely shared ideas, what worked, what didn't work, what would we do differently next year when we do a similar program at the 2020 PeDRA Annual Conference. And then everyone was free to enjoy the rest of the weekend. So in terms of the cross-cutting themes discussion, which again, I'll focus the remainder of this pretty short webinar on, the way we designed the cross-cutting themes discussion and the patient track at the 2019 PeDRA Annual Conference was to have 3 rounds of discussion in one single afternoon. And during the first round, the 30 or so patients, parents, and advocates who we had in attendance at the conference were grouped into small groups at round tables, more or less by disease type. So genetic skin diseases, we had representation from about 10 individuals with genetic skin diseases or from those advocacy group communities. We had about 10 from inflammatory skin disease groups, again, patients, advocates, family members, and then about 10 patients, parents, advocates from the birthmarks community. So those groups spent about 45 minutes discussing what mattered to them, what questions did they have, a number of different things focused on their disease experience to see if they can ultimately unlock shared themes that might cross-cut across multiple disease spaces. And they provided a list of their discussion and notes from what they talked about on flip charts. So those can be discussed later on during the session. After that, the groups were mixed randomly. So we kept everybody in 3 small subgroups of about 10 people each, but this time they weren't grouped according to disease category. So instead of being grouped by genetics, inflammatory birthmarks, everybody was grouped randomly. And that was another about 45 minutes. Finally, for round 3, everybody came together and discussed outcomes from the small group discussions, and the facilitator for the session worked to bring together themes, takeaways, distill the notes, see what kind of rose to the forefront in people's mind, how the discussion went, so that we could package things up in some way to think about and move forward into the future. And as I just touched on, the way the discussion went, the moderators of the different subgroups were asked to lead a discussion around what's really most important to everybody around the table, to explore what common themes existed amongst the different things that people were discussing, and then to try to bin those different components into broader categories. So with the next few slides, I'll just walk through the outcomes of the different discussions and show you hopefully how there was this, I think, very interesting progression as you looked at the results from the subgroups discussing amongst themselves within specific disease areas when grouped together, what really rose to the forefront, what did they talk about, what was important to them, how that changed when the groups were mixed randomly. So you'd mix somebody with a rare genetic skin disease with somebody with a more common inflammatory skin disease, for example, and what commonality did they find, what was important to them. And then I'll wrap things up by just sharing the outcome from the full group discussion, where everybody came together and talked about their experience in the small group discussion and came up with some themes from the subgroup discussions, but also some new ideas, things that mattered to them on a higher level. And I think those are really the takeaways, the things that PeDRA researchers, patients involved in the research process through PeDRA can really think about incorporating into their research moving forward, maybe diving deeper and seeing if they could refine that into a specific research question, or maybe integrating some of the concepts into studies that they have getting off the ground, studies they'll do in future, or things they're working on now. So you can see it up on the screen, and I'll just go through things briefly for the purposes of audio, for those of you who are listening. The group who focused on genetics in the small group discussion in round 1, the pressing issues that they noted, the common themes in research, were centered around comorbidities, specifically cardiovascular, ear and eye related, psychosocial burden of disease, specifically bullying, male manifestations of disease, the known versus the unknown, dispelling myths, tools to educate doctors, telemedicine, and fundraising. So some of the things certainly touched on different components of disease. Some touched on actually some functional components related to patient advocacy organizations and nonprofits, all relevant to the space of peds-derm research. I think this is every discussion was certainly very relevant and important, and this is no exception there. In terms of group 2, the inflammatory subgroup, what they came up with was a family-wide impact of disease, so the burden on caregivers and siblings as well as the child patient, the effect on very young children, so those under the age of 2, working on acceptance, awareness of disease, the burden of care, specifically the financial burden, and that might get back to where some inflammatory diseases are a little bit ahead of some of the other disease groups in terms of the availability of therapies, access to care, the cultural impact of disease, biomarkers, and communication. The birthmark subgroup then came up with laser treatment, the risk of anesthesia, the connections with support groups help. So can they look at the impact of a patient advocacy group and involvement with such a group as actually being beneficial or detrimental to overall health outcomes? Self-image, data gaps regarding treatment outcomes, burden of care, again, financial, and this gets back to the inflammatory group as well. They had the same item on their list. Establishing consensus for medical professionals for disease treatment, disease management, and then seizure medications and challenges. So after that, the round 2 subgroup discussion took place. And this time, all the groups were random, so it's interesting to see how the lists differed versus the first round of discussion when the participants are grouped according to disease type. So in this case, the first group came up with the importance of understanding depression and anxiety and having appropriate referrals to mental health professionals, early diagnosis of disease, prevention of disease, specifically thinking about something like sunscreen, the child-specific outcome measures for treatment, limited treatment options, the burden on family, which was discussed in the earlier discussion as well, skewed perspectives, education and awareness, and generating data for policymakers. The second subgroup came up with understanding acceptance or advancing acceptance of patients with disease, self-empowerment, self-determination, the burden of treatment, particularly with respect to cost and the time lost from school or work, diagnostic criteria for disease, telemedicine, and interspecialty learning. Group 3 then came up with understanding disease differences, isolation, social impact of disease, pain relief and management, empathy from healthcare providers, specifically medical doctors, treatment navigation, kindness, and how to ask questions. So I think you can get a sense for the differences in the nature of the discussions when groups were focused within a disease area and when they were dispersed randomly across different diseases. I think quite interesting to see the different priorities that rose to the top in terms of what mattered to patients, what commonality was there, and then how could they start to sort of put those things together. And putting things together is what the final part of the discussion really was, when the full group had a discussion moderated by the overall group facilitator. And this is where they really worked to bin the outcomes from what was shared in the small group discussions, and then some higher level common themes. And the four big things that came out from this discussion were around treatment, were around the medical community, were around symptoms, and then biology, which came up but to a lesser extent, and probably something that could have been focused on more, but I think something worth noting is the underlying biology of disease is certainly important and interesting to patients, but different components rise to the surface perhaps amongst the patient community, and the deep biology is where the basic and translational researchers come into the picture. They need to unlock some of those mysteries and understand some of those things. So in terms of treatment, what fell on the first bin was understanding the long-term toll that treatment would take, certainly relevant for anyone considering treating a chronic skin disease as a child, the risk of treatment, working on prevention more so than the treatment, affordability of treatment, making informed treatment decisions, having universal treatment options, drug repurposing, when to teach or intervene. So at what time course in a disease, at what point over the course of a disease is it time to teach or intervene? And then engaging with patient support groups again. In terms of working with the medical community, dispelling myths rose to the forefront, gaining consensus for treatment, gathering treatment outcomes data, having best practices for data collection, connecting with non-derm specialists, so those outside the field of pediatric dermatology, connecting with them in a meaningful way to provide the best possible care for patients, understanding pain management, working on empathy amongst healthcare professionals, and working with them to come up with early diagnosis for disease. In terms of symptoms, what ended up in that bin were the concepts around dryness, skin dryness related to disease. This is again across everybody who was in the discussion, so about 30 patients, parents, and advocates from all different disease spaces. Dryness, the visibility of disease, comorbidities associated with disease, nails, calluses, and blisters, bullying, shame, suicidal ideation, and when to teach or intervene, again, to kind of flank the symptoms in the treatment categories. And then biology, this was a lesser part of the discussion, but was discussed amongst the group. Understanding shared mechanisms across multiple diseases, of course, rises to the forefront when bringing the group together to discuss the underlying biology of different diseases, the microbiome, which is something that has received significant attention of late and may link a number of different diseases and their causes, and then the genetic signatures for disease. So in terms of next steps, this is a long process and something we're very proud and excited to be a part of and in the early stages of. But on the heels of receiving this PeDRA award and executing the 2019 PeDRA Annual Conference, the immediate next step is to share the outcomes from the conference, and to some extent that's what's happening on this webinar. It's a 25-minute webinar. It's not going to share every detail that might be worth sharing. So following this webinar and any other way that we decide to get the outcomes from the 2019 conference out, we will be putting in place the patient advisory committee, which I discussed on an earlier slide. That's the kind of group that as they begin to meet regularly, we could see integrating feedback and outcomes from the 2019 conference and other activities that are taking place through PeDRA and through the PeDRA Engagement Award to integrate lessons learned, priority questions, interesting topics into new PeDRA study ideas and to help hopefully influence ongoing PeDRA studies and future PeDRA studies. And that's what it comes down to in the final bullet that you can see on the screen. So really integrating outcomes of not just the 2019 annual conference, but everything PeDRA is doing as it engages with patients in the research process moving forward. And really strengthening that community between researchers, patients, and everybody else who is part of the stakeholder community in pediatric dermatology. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and joining me for this webinar. I want to thank every patient advocacy organization who provided support for the PeDRA award that was received by PeDRA in 2019. Their logos are depicted on the screen right now. I want to thank the key personnel, PeDRA members and leaders who participated on the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute Engagement Award and continue to participate in that way. Those being Dr. Keith Choate from Yale University, Dr. Lisa Arkin from University of Wisconsin, and Dr. Winnis Tom from University of California, San Diego. And finally, thanks to the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute for their Eugene Washington PeDRA Engagement Award and everything that it is allowing us to do. We are so grateful. So thank you again for your attention. If you have any questions, please visit the PeDRA website or send an email to me at mike.siegel@pedraresearch.org. That's mike.siegel@pedraresearch.org. Thank you very much.